All right, welcome. Gosh, you guys are such a good audience. You got quiet right away. I appreciate that. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Gonzalez, and I'm the Government Affairs Director here at the Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC, and thank you for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit with offices in both San Francisco and Sacramento. PPIC has a new PPIC report titled The Impact of Proposition 47 on Crime and Recidivism. I know that's why you guys are here, so you know this. And you should have received a copy of the report on your chair. There are additional copies at the registration table, including a couple copies of the appendixes if you're interested. The full report, along with the slides from today's presentation, are both available now on our website at ppic.org. For today's program, PPIC researcher Mia Bird will be presenting the main finding from this new report. Then her co-author, Magnus Lofstrom, will moderate a discussion with a great panel of experts, which will then be followed by questions from the audience. I'd like to also acknowledge the co-authors who are here today. Brandon Martin, is Steve Raphael here? I haven't met the elusive Steve Raphael, and Viet Nguyen. You should have also received an agenda and all of the speakers' bios on the back side, so in the interest of time, we'll only do a brief introduction today. Please note that we also have an online audience today, so when you're asking questions, we'll bring a microphone around so that you can speak into the microphone. A couple of more things. Later today, you'll receive a survey. We love our surveys here at PPIC, so please respond to those surveys. We do take your comments into consideration. And lastly, please turn off your cell phones. It's safe to say that this report has garnered a lot of attention, particularly from proponents and opponents of Proposition 47. But I want to be clear, this report is not a statistical picture of crime rates, and this has frustrated some folks. The fact of the matter, crime is up in California, and crime has impacts on victims and communities that we need to acknowledge. It also has impact on the offenders and their family. But California has made some significant changes in our criminal justice system in the past 8 years, and these changes affected classes of offenders differently, and in the case of Proposition 47, changed criminal penalties. This means that simply reporting crime statistics doesn't provide a clear picture of the drivers of crime. There is one sign of hope that I want to bring to your attention, and as a recovering policymaker from the legislature, I'm really excited about this. Our team at PPIC has been working with our state partners and local agencies that are interested in using data to address crime rates and recidivism. This is not easy given the large shifts in the systems and the lack of statewide data systems and legal limitations on sharing data. But this is a very hopeful sign, and we really want to thank those partners for this effort. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mia Bird.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you all for being here. I, for one, am really looking forward to the panel, so I am going to briefly walk you through the findings from this report, and then we will get on to hearing from them. So Prop 47 reduced penalties for lower-level drug and property offenses. And what we saw in the year following Prop 47 was a pretty large reduction in prison and jail populations. Jails and prisons taken together, we saw a fall of about 15,000 inmates. So that's a fairly large change. And this change, this expected change, is what supporters had hoped for. They had hoped to reduce involvement with the criminal justice system. And they'd also hoped that we could redirect some of those resources that were spent on corrections toward treatment programs that would ultimately reduce recidivism, specifically behavioral health programs. Opponents, on the other hand, were concerned. They were concerned that Prop 47 would overburden local systems. They were concerned that it would potentially lead to increases in crime. So for this report, what we are doing is we're analyzing the effect of Prop 47 on crime and recidivism rates. We first examine crime rates, and to do that, we look at changes over time within California and changes across the country in violent and property crime rates. And we draw on data from the California Department of Justice and from the FBI. We then turn to look at jail bookings and recidivism rates. And to do that, we draw on data collected through the BSCC PPIC multi-county study. This is a collaborative effort. It involves the PPIC, the Board of State and Community Corrections, and 12 partner counties who are participating in this study to help us better understand how policy changes are affecting statewide outcomes. So what you're seeing here is violent and property crime rates over a pretty long time period. And what you can take away from this is that we are really at historic lows in terms of crime rates. We haven't seen rates this low since the late 1960s. However, what you'll see in this presentation is that recently, from 2014 to 2016, we have seen some increases in crime rates. In particular, we saw violent crime rates go up by about 13%. Now, part of that increase is explained by two factors. The first is that the FBI changed the offenses that are included in that violent crime category. And the second is that there was a change in reporting within the LAPD. And offenses that hadn't been captured as violent crimes were captured following Prop 47. And so when we account for those two changes, the violent crime rate increase drops down to just under 5%. Over the same period, from 2014 to 2016, we do see also a slight increase in property crime rates. And so our task here is to determine whether those changes are the result of Prop 47 or whether they may be caused by some other factors. With respect to violent crime, what you're seeing here is a comparison between violent crime rates in California and violent crime rates in other states that are similar to California. And what we learned by making this comparison is that although violent crime rates did increase in California, these appear to be part of a nationwide trend. So it appears that there are other factors driving the increase in violent crime rates. And therefore, we do not attribute that increase to Prop 47. With respect to property crime, though, there's somewhat of a different story. When we compare changes in property crime rates in California to those in other states, what we see is that California actually has somewhat higher property crime rates post-Prop 47. And in fact, that this higher level of property crime is really driven by larcenies and specifically by thefts from motor vehicles. So to examine jail bookings, and this is sort of a measure of criminal justice contact, this gives us an idea of how many people are entering the criminal justice system on a regular basis. Where again, we're focusing on those 12 multi-county study counties. This is a subset of the state. And what we're seeing is that jail bookings declined by about 8% in the year following Prop 47. And what you see here is jail bookings specifically for individuals on Prop 47 offenses. And we see about a 38% reduction in bookings into jails for those offenses. And you can also see that there's really the expected switch. Prior to Prop 47, we saw about 2/3 of these bookings for felonies. Post Prop 47, we see about 1/3 for felonies. So everything that we kind of expected might occur in terms of jail bookings, you're seeing unfolding here. And what's really interesting, we found in those 12 counties, in the 1 year following Prop 47, there was a decline of almost 50,000 individuals having contact with the jail system. So that's about a 10% decline in the number of people that are entering our jail system. When we turn to recidivism rates, what we're doing here is we're comparing two groups. We're comparing a group of Prop 47 offenders that are released after Prop 47, and we're comparing their outcomes to individuals that were released prior to Prop 47 who had committed similar offenses and who had similar characteristics. And this is how we're trying to understand the effect of Prop 47 on recidivism. So here what you're seeing, those blue bars represent that pre-group. So people released before Prop 47, and the orange bar represents that post-group. And what you can see here in that first set of bars is an overall decline in rearrest rates, about 1.8 percentage point decline. And you can see in that next set of bars that this is really driven by a decline in Prop 47 offenses. So about a 10.3 percentage point decline in the rearrest rate for Prop 47 offenses. And if you look in even more detail, you can see that this is largely driven by a decline in rearrest for drug possession. And what that tells us is that Prop 47 likely sent a signal to law enforcement to reprioritize their resources away from arrest for drug possession and towards more serious offenses. We also examined 2-year reconviction rates as a second measure of recidivism. And we see a somewhat similar story here. We see an overall decline in reconviction rates of about 3.1 percentage points. And we see that this is largely driven, again, by declines in reconvictions for Prop 47 offenses, and that these declines persist across property and drug offenses. And what we do here is we want to know, how much of this decline in reconviction rates is due to just a decline in rearrest, and how much of it generally represents a change in convictions. And so we, conditional on rearrest, we look at, did the post-period group, did they have lower reconviction rates, given that they were rearrested, compared to similar individuals in the pre-group? And we find that yes, they did. So there is a genuine reduction in both rearrest rates and reconviction rates following Prop 47. And given the way that recidivism is measured through things like rearrest and reconviction rates, it's not easy to tell whether this is a change in reoffending behavior that's driving these outcomes, or a change in law enforcement practice, or prosecutorial or public defender practices. And we think that it's possible that both are at work here. And finally, as many of you know, Prop 47 redirected about 65% of the state correctional savings towards mental health and substance use programs. The BSCC is in charge of allocating these funds, and they've allocated about $104 million for the grant period of 2017 to 2020. We're excited to see if these funds have an impact, but currently we're not able to see that impact, so that the research we've presented today, it doesn't reflect the effects of that increased funding because it's too early to tell. In summary, we find that Prop 47 did not affect violent crime rates, but it likely did increase property crime rates, and specifically thefts from motor vehicles. We find that Prop 47 significantly reduced jail bookings and the number of individuals involved with the jail system, and that it also reduced rearrest and reconviction rates. So I'm just going to invite my co-author, Magnus Lofstrom, up here to introduce our panel, and if our panelists would also please join us.
Well, thank you, Mia. We are very fortunate here to have an excellent panel. It's going to provide us with various perspectives on what we've heard and Prop 47, how it has played out. And on your left here, we have Jerry Dyer. He is the Chief of Police in Fresno. In the middle, we have Katie Howard. She is the Executive Director of the Board of State and Community Corrections. And closest to me here, we have George Gascón. He is the District Attorney of San Francisco. So I think we'll kick this off by getting some perspective and insights from you. And we're now close to 4 years since voters passed Prop 47, and before that we've had a number of other reforms. And so I want to hear, from your perspective, what are the key lessons so far? I want to start with District Attorney Gascón.
Sure. So, I think that Mia laid out the baseline for this conversation very well. But this is a really good report. And obviously, anytime that you're looking at numbers, statistics, there is multiple ways to look at things. And I think it's important for us to recognize that. When we talk about crime went up, I'd like to also say that in compared to what? And what is the context upon which crime has gone up? 2014, we experienced some of the lowest crime levels in this state for many years. You have to go back really to about 1960 to proportionally see the same level of crime. Although I'm very idealistic, I don't think that we're ever going to get to a date of no crime, right? So the reality is that Prop 47 passed in 2014, but that was also a year of really unprecedented crime reductions. Then we see an increase in 2015, then we see again a decrease in 2016. So I'm a little concerned when we start drawing inferences that the crime has gone up or the crime is going down based on this. I think that there's just a lot of ways to look at this. UCI did a study on this area, and they actually created a fictional state that would compare to California, And they noticed that if you compare the two, that there really was no discernible differences. I can tell you from my own jurisdiction that our car break-ins actually started to go up before Prop 47, and now they have gone down. In fact, this year we're at a 20% reduction year to date, and it appears that we're continuing in that trend. And, you know, we are under Prop 47. We have the same district attorney. We have the same police department, still with the same number of people, basically, that we had in 2014, although they're going to start hiring more folks. So I bring this out only because there are so many complexities when we're looking at this. But there were some things that we intended from the very beginning to do with Prop 47. And one of them was the reduction of incarceration. In this country, we have incarcerated people at rates that we could no longer continue to do. And frankly, many economists would tell you that we have reached the level of actually an inverse, where we're not getting any real value for our incarceration dollars about 2 decades ago. This, by the way, has destroyed primarily communities of color. So there are significant social implications to the way that we were doing policing and prosecutions in the state and around the country that were very socially irresponsible, as well as I would argue economically irresponsible, given that your returning investment was no longer there and hasn't been there for 2 decades. So I think that it's important that when we're looking at this and we're saying crime went up, and you know, and I understand that, you know, especially those who are against it, you know, they predicted that, you know, the world was going to fall apart. It really hasn't, not so far anyway. That we put these things into context and we start thinking about what kind of society do we want to live in. Do we want to live in a society that incarcerates people just simply because we can, or do we want to be thoughtful about the way that we use that very intense intervention, which is actually putting somebody in jail? I believe that most of us would say that we want to be very thoughtful about the way that we incarcerate people, and quite frankly, the voters spoke very clearly in this area. I think it was a shock for the system, especially for law enforcement. And by the way, I have been in the business for over 30 years. I ran operations in the LAPD. You know, one of the things that Mia talked about is when LAPD altered their reporting numbers, that impacts the state numbers. Well, it does, right? When I run operations in LAPD, we're arresting about 100,000 people a year. LAPD alone can swing crime numbers for the state one way or the other just by the way that we do business. And we in law enforcement got addicted to putting a lot of people in jail. And it paid off in terms of political, political currency. We got more funding, police departments continue to grow, prosecutors continue to grow for about 3 decades. Those are all things that all of a sudden people are starting to say the world is shifting. And you know, when the world shifts under us, especially human beings, we have a hard time dealing with change. And it's taking policing and I think prosecutors some time to adjust that there's a new reality, and maybe the interventions that were used freely before have to be reevaluated, and we have to look for other solutions. Now, am I saying that I'm happy that some numbers perhaps went up and there may be some correlation? Of course not. And we got to continue to try to look for ways to reduce crime. But I think it has to be in the context of a total picture, and I think it's somewhat problematic for me to just simply say crime went up. There's a deeper story here that I think that we all need to look at, and I hope that this report actually, which is very well done by the way, and I commend the authors for it, has a lot of insights, and I think that when we move away from the headlines, there's a lot more meat into this report that can provide some meaningful conversations in the years to come.
Dr. Howard?
Thank you very much. Katie Howard with the BSCC. I'm very happy to be here. I want to talk about 2 things quickly in response to your question, Magnus, about lessons learned. One of the things that the BSCC is responsible is collecting jail profile data. So we have census data from every jail across the 57 counties. One county doesn't have a jail. And when Mia spoke from the report, she was providing information about bookings in the 12 counties that are participating in the multi-county study. I think that's about 40% of the state's population-ish.
60.
Oh, 60, it's a lot. But anyway, I'm here to make a plug for the most recently updated jail profile survey information on the BSCC's website. As many of you may have heard representatives from the BSCC before, we take the view, and I think these two gentlemen on the panel will reflect this, there are 58 different counties and 58 different stories across the state. When you look at the statewide average daily population in county jails, as the PPIC report reflects as well, there is a rather significant drop in overall ADP. So I would commend you to go to the website at bscc.ca.gov. We have just completed the update today to include the first quarter of 2018. There's been a fairly significant additional drop in the statewide ADP, and you can find a whole lot more detailed information on a county-by-county basis. The other thing that I find interesting and a little bit surprising is that there's obviously a lot of different changes in the field, explanations of which depend on who you ask, in my humble view. But the changes in felony and misdemeanor numbers on our ADP have not changed that much over time. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. Tons of good information is available on our website. The second thing in terms of lessons learned, but I'll wait to respond to questions later, is to tell you that there are 23 relatively recently implemented grant programs that were the successful grantees under our Prop 47 grant process. We have a handout here today. There are several copies over there in the with light blue blurbs describing each one on a half page. That's the $103 million in state savings from the first 3 years. And I'm going to tell you more about that process. I think it's a really excellent example of the BSCC's work in implementing Prop 47, and so I'll hold some comments later. But great reason for optimism under the services that are going to be going out under these grants.
Chief Dyer?
Lessons learned. Yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. Number one, when you're a voter, to be careful of what a title is on a particular proposition. In this case, proposition was titled the Safe Schools and Neighborhood Act. And I've yet to see safer schools and neighborhoods as a result of Proposition 47. I think the second lesson is that we have to be careful as a society to not implement too many changes to our criminal justice system and to allow whatever changes are made a period of time so that we can effectively assess those. I'll give you an example. In October of 2011 was the implementation of Assembly Bill 109, which was realignment. And that shifted a lot of the inmates to local jurisdictions as well as supervision from parole to probation. That impact was significant. And law enforcement, local law enforcement, county probation, we were just getting used to that shift in resources as well as shift in responsibilities when 3 years and a month later you have Proposition 47. And literally it was like for local law enforcement trying to take a drink of water out of a fire hose because there was so much coming at us in terms of responsibility for these individuals. Realignment effectively maximize the capacity of our jails. Jails were already under some type of a federal order, so there was absolutely no room at these local jails. And so when you take a proposition like Proposition 47, which some may say that AB 109 was the fire, Proposition 47 was the gasoline that kept that fire burning. And what ended up happening is when you reduce charges from a felony to a misdemeanor, and local jails are not housing people for misdemeanors, then there are no consequences for those individuals who are committing crime, whether that is petty theft or whether that is a drug charge. And they go hand in hand because individuals that are out there addicted to drugs are the individuals that are out there stealing to continue to support their habit. And I have several stories that I'm going to share today about individuals that have inundated our criminal justice system since the passage of Proposition 47. And I think the other lesson to be learned is that when you look at these individuals we're dealing with, they're not low-level offenders. Their last arrest may be for a low-level offense, but they are still serious offenders. When I was the president of California Police Chiefs in 2008, I was part of a working group, small working group that looked at prisoner population in California for the purpose of reducing the population as a result of the lawsuits initiated by Coleman and Plata. We looked inside the prison system. I was at about a dozen prisons in California, looked at who was occupying the beds in those prisons, what the technical violations were, and so forth. And here's what I found. We did not have low-level offenders in California prisons. That was a false narrative. The average individual in prison at that time had 6 felony convictions. And so the people that were in there were serious, violent individuals who were career criminals. Those individuals are no longer in jail or are in prison. There's no room for them at the jail. That's why they're out in our society today, continually breaking into cars, stealing property, as well as stealing from our stores and throughout our community. And that is why we see an increase in larcenies. And there's a lot of reasons in terms of why we may not have been able to have a direct correlation between violent crime and Prop 47. I do believe there is some, but it's always difficult to say there's a direct cause. I do believe there's an indirect cause. I have 3 incidents where an individual was arrested for drugs, would have been a felony, turned out to be a misdemeanor. Short time later, all 3 of those individuals killed someone. 2 shootings, one of them a stabbing. So I do believe there's a indirect cause, and if you ask the victims' families, there's a direct cause as well.
Thank you. Let's start off talking about something that I don't think is particularly controversial. And there are many controversial aspects of this reform. There's no doubt about that. We've heard some differing opinions here. But I think let's start off by talking about the state savings and the role that BSCC played in this, in allocating those. It's a big part of it. It's $104 million that were being allocated recently. Director Howard, can you tell us a little bit about the review process, how these programs were selected, and maybe give us an idea of what kind of programs?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks very much. Yes, so in Prop 47, those who drafted the proposition, I'm sure had to determine which state agency ought to be given the responsibility for administering a grant program per the language in the proposition itself to public agencies to provide mental health and substance use disorder treatment to people involved in the criminal justice system. As they scanned the horizon, they landed on BSCC, which was news to us, you know, when that was first came out. So as Magnus has said, the determination was left to the Department of Finance to figure out what 65% or what the total state savings was as a result of Prop 47. So basically, there was a fair bit of discussion around this, but the decision and the responsibility for making the calculation was with the Department of Finance. And while there were some initial estimates that had come out that I think tended to look a little bit more back of the envelope type calculation about what some anticipated reductions in state prison days would be, what that might translate into. I think there was a lot of surprise initially that the state savings were at the level that they were, which in year 1, so as we all know, Prop 47 passed in 2014. The state savings was first calculated a year later, and what the state determined initially was $24.36 million. The legislature added $10 million to that, so it wound up being $34 million in the first year. The second year state savings at 65% coming to the BSCC grant was $24 million again, and then in the third year, the second year was 28, and the third year was 40 million. So that totaled up to 103 million. The BSCC had really a lot of leeway in determining how to structure the grant program. And I believe that there was an understanding in the field, and I think there's a really good story to be told about how the BSCC carried out its responsibilities under Prop 47. But this was a new grant program with services that were familiar to some of the things the BSCC had done before. And we took the responsibilities seriously to go across the state and listen to what people's concerns were about Prop 47 and what people thought the grant program should include. We started with a listening tour and visited 5 different cities across the state, Fresno being one, San Diego, San Bernardino County, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. We heard a great deal from locals, both people who supported Prop 47 and who didn't. And so many of you may be familiar with the BSCC's general process on grant making. It is to form what we call an executive steering committee. The board appointed 2 board members to co-chair that committee, Supervisor Leticia Perez from Kern County and Scott Budnick, who's the Assembly's appointee to the board and a criminal justice reform advocate. We went through an arduous process, which was something reflective of the intense public interest across the state, and that as our board was meeting and discussing the Prop 47 development process, we heard from, well, probably hundreds of people, if you count it all up, about what that process should include. We made a wide open invitation with some help from the legislature, but I'm here to tell you we would have done this anyway. The legislature came in and added some additional grant purposes and direction to the BSCC in a bill that was passed in 2015, and that had to do with a requirement that formerly system-involved people would be members of that executive steering committee. I think that was very, very beneficial to the process. After a long kind of recruitment phase, we identified members to serve on the committee. There were 18 people, 6 of whom were formerly system-involved. At the first in-person meeting of that executive steering committee, we had a panel where the 6 formerly system-involved people spoke to the rest of the committee and the interested audience there about their own experiences and what was helpful to them in turning their lives around. And it was instrumental in the formation of that grant and the scoring criteria, the guiding principles for the grant. I would commend to you, if you're interested, a look at the RFP that executive steering committee came up with. The RFP was let in November of 2016, and the awards were made in June of 2017. So now we're at the point of 23 grantees across the state. As I mentioned, we have summaries over on the side table. This is also on our website. 23 successful grantees from across the state. The committee decided to do 2 different funding pots for the $103 million, just over $103 million, where people could apply for what was called a large scope project of up to $6 million or a small scope project of up to $1 million. And Los Angeles County was able to secure support from the Executive Steering Committee to be allowed to compete for a $20 million grant, which they were successful in getting. We had 58 applications come in. We had the Executive Steering Committee score all of those from the rating criteria that they developed. And now the programs are in various stages of up and running, working with their subcontractors. There's a huge emphasis on working with community-based organizations. The rating criteria included a requirement that at least 50% of the grant dollars be passed through to CBOs. Some, as you'll see in the grant summaries, are passing through numbers larger than that, 78% and higher for their pass-throughs to local CBOs. All of the services, each and every one of the grants is providing services in mental health and substance use disorder treatment. Most are also doing housing-related, diversion programs, and other community-based services. I've been able to visit the program in Contra Costa County, which is really, really impressive. They are doing what they're calling a LEAD Plus program. Many of you are familiar with the law enforcement assisted diversion programs. The program is centered around the city of Antioch and is partnering with the Antioch Police Department and the County Behavioral Health Department and housing and all of those Contra Costa County services, as well as community-based organizations. So those and the many other programs are going to be responsible, of course, for providing, for conducting their own data collection and evaluation of those programs. So really what I want to say here today is that I'm optimistic about what we are going to hear from these service providers as the grants have more experience. But as people have been saying today, they're still relatively recently beginning these services.
Thank you. Chief Dyer, so one of the things that's, one of the findings of the report, and that's quite clear in the data, is that we're seeing a noticeable drop in arrests. And given the fact that crime is not coming down during this period, what are the explanations for arrests being down past Prop 47?
Very simple. Limited amount of resources in law enforcement today. Every police chief has to determine how they're going to use those resources effectively and what's going to give you the most return on investment. And so whenever you have laws that change and take away your ability to arrest certain individuals for a felony, and you know there's no room in the jail for misdemeanors, then you shift your resources towards other individuals, gang members, going after violent criminals in your community. I can say that's what happened in Fresno. I believe that's what happened around the state. And as a result, arrest went down significantly. Those individuals that used to be arrested for felony drug possession were now being issued a misdemeanor citation. And I believe you saw the numbers go from about, I think, from 2/3 to 1/3 or something of that nature in this report. It didn't surprise me. But the reason for that importance of being able to arrest those individuals on a felony, those individuals that are out there possessing drugs, our officers would stop individuals that were believed to be involved in a crime or suspicious. They would search them, they would find drugs on them, they'd arrest them for a felony charge, book them into jail, preventing that individual from going to do another crime, breaking into a car, breaking into a house. That was the effectiveness of what we had in law enforcement. Those same individuals, when we did arrest them for a felony, oftentimes they went before a judge. The judge would say, would you like treatment or a felony conviction? The response would be, I'll take treatment. And that is the incentive that we had to get those individuals in there. When that incentive went away, so did our efforts in arresting those individuals. And today, we have people that are arrested for misdemeanor drug possession. They go before a judge. I have to add, in Fresno County, 2/3 of those individuals never show to court. They fail to appear. And it's a vicious cycle because we find them, we issue them another citation, they fail to appear. So 2/3 of them never show up before a judge. But those individuals that do now, for a misdemeanor, when the question is asked, do you want a misdemeanor conviction, knowing there's no consequences, no room in the jail, or treatment, they say, I'll take the misdemeanor probation and be released and continue with a life of crime.
District Attorney Gascón said one of the objectives of Prop 47 was to move offenders into treatment and programming. We just heard that might not be the case. What do you think is happening? Is it harder to get offenders into treatment and programming now?
Well, let's begin by going back to what it was, because I think it's important to go back to what it was. To begin with, if you look at any jail in this country, but let's take California, and somewhere around 40% of every person in the jail has been diagnosed with some level of mental health problems. Most of them also are self-medicating themselves, and they have substance abuse problems. You can talk to any medical expert, and it will tell you very quickly that incarceration doesn't reduce illness. It doesn't make a mentally ill person better. It does not take away your drug addiction. But let's also talk about what we used to do before the treatment, because I've heard this many times. In fact, I heard it recently from the city of LA. For those of you that are not familiar, the city has almost 4 million people in population. I wanted how many people were in drug court before Prop 47. There were a total of about 300 at any given time. So the concept that we were treating people before is somewhat questionable. But what we do know now is that we're moving funds, and communities are beginning to experiment with different ways of treating drug addiction and mental health, which drive many of the crimes that Chief Dyer is so accurately pointing out. I also want to say that the back of the envelope for the computations of the savings actually were done by state budget people, but they were done based on what we were paying for bed space, and we forget that we were paying at a much higher rate than the state-owned jails because we were paying for private jails at a very high rate, and that was part of the computation. The state then, and you could argue one way or the other, they decided that that was not going to be part of the computation. We were going to only use what would it cost to use a state jail. That's fine, or prison actually. And so the savings came down. But it was not the crafters of the proposition that actually sat around a bar with having a few drinks and in the back of an envelope came up with some numbers. That's not how the savings were calculated. The savings were calculated based on real numbers, and that's what the state was paying for, because we're paying for a lot of private prison time that we don't pay anymore. But the bottom line is that after the early 1980s, we basically shut down our mental health systems in the state. We began to pour a lot of people onto our streets, and the money that was going to be saved from that was supposed to go into community-based services. It never materialized. Our jails became the de facto mental health institutions. If you talk to anyone in LA County, in fact, I have heard now 2 elected sheriffs, the prior one and the current one, say that LA County is the biggest mental health institution in the country. Well, it is. Then you talk to any mental health expert, and they will tell you that a jail is probably the worst place that you can put somebody who's mentally ill, because they will cycle in and out and in and out. And yes, guess what? Jails don't make you better. And let's talk about drugs for a second, because I think it's important to have a real conversation about drugs. Drug use in this country happens equally across social economic groups, equally across genders, but the people that happen to be the ones that get arrested, prosecuted, and sent to jails and prisons happen to be mostly people of color. I was born in a country where crime is very, very low. It happens to be a dictatorship. It happens to be a place where a lot of people go to prison for many things. We can lock everybody up and crime will be very, very low. The question that we have to ask ourselves is this the moral thing to do? Is this the right thing to do? Is this even economically feasible? Because guess what? Our prison system was on receivership before Prop 47. You know what that translates to in the private world? That would be you're bankrupt and you have a federal judge overseeing how you're going to spend your money. But for realignment in Prop 47, we brought the population down. Let's talk about disproportionality. Prop 47 has brought down disproportionality, meaning while we continue to arrest African Americans and Latinos at a higher level than we do any other group, it had a tremendous impact in lowering that up. Now we can continue the addiction of just simply locking people up and continue to break the bank and continue to build prisons instead of schools. By the way, in a period that we did not build a single university for about 2.5 decades, we were building prisons left and right, and we ran out of prison space, and then we started having private prisons. I think it's important to have those conversations. I think it is morally right. I think it's economically right, and I think it's socially right. The United States still incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation. And I'm not talking about industrialized nations, I'm talking about any other nation that reports these numbers. So let's have an honest, moral, ethically based conversation around where do we want the criminal justice system to go in the next 10, 20 years, and then put the numbers there. They're important. Let's see what they mean, and let's see what we can do about it. But let's stop talking about going back to the old days, about putting people in prisons because they have a drug addiction, because they have a mental health problem, which is what we have done for the last 3 decades.
All right. One of the main findings of this report is an increase in larcenies that was driven by thefts from cars. So car break-ins, there's some evidence of increase in shoplifting as well. But how do we tackle this? Chief Dyer, do you want to?
Well, number one, you have to have consequences. If you're raising your children and there are no consequences, bad behavior continues. And that's what we're seeing today in the criminal justice system. We have individuals that are being arrested without consequences, rearrested, no consequences. I'll give you an example. This individual we had in Fresno, Cesar Garcia, he did petty thefts, all of them under $950 because the threshold was raised to $950. And all of them under $950, told the clerks they couldn't do anything about it. 8 of these in one day, but it gets better. We have an individual named Damari Pearson in a 17-month period, 48 petty thefts, and 43 of those were under $950. Now, there's a reason why they are doing that. There used to be a law in place. It was Penal Code Section 666. Petty theft with a prior. So if you were convicted of a petty theft, you could, the next time you get arrested for it, be arrested on a felony, which was a significant deterrent. The second thing was officers, if they could prove that an individual entered the store with the intent to steal, they could be arrested for a burglary, a felony. Those are gone. Those consequences are gone. And then I have Stephen Gomez. Since Proposition 47 passed, he's been arrested 83 times and booked into our jail 83 times. And early released to avoid overcrowding 74 times. Now I want us to add up all the victims behind those 3 individuals. And you can see that Proposition 47 had a tremendous impact on victimization. I hear us talk a lot about recidivism. And yes, recidivism is important, but it pales in comparison to victimization. And that's what we need to be looking at today, because there is a segment of our population out there today that is being victimized over and over and over again. So much to the point at Walmart in California, where the crooks refer to going into Walmart now as Wally shopping, and they go and they steal, and everything's under $950, and they steal every day. It's their lifestyle, it's their career. They've now in Fresno had to hire contract law enforcement for Fresno PD, spending over $600,000 a year to have an officer presence at their stores. We have clerks that are afraid to confront these individuals for fear of injury or fear of being sued. We owe it to those individuals that are convenience store clerks and Home Depots and Walmarts. We owe it to those individuals to protect them, to prevent their property from being stolen. And quite frankly, today, we don't have those protections in place because we don't have consequences in place to prevent those from occurring. We have to have consequences that will deter this behavior. And to date, we don't. And if we don't do something different, we're going to continue down this path. Now, I agree with George in the fact that I do not believe that prison is the answer. I do believe prison is a part of the answer. And when you take it away totally, you've lost significant consequences. And I'm not a lock 'em up person. I believe in second and third chances for individuals. I do believe in treatment for drug offenders. But many of these individuals that are addicted to drugs for many years, there has to be an incentive for them to take treatment, to seek treatment, and a disincentive for them not to. And if they're simply going to have a misdemeanor on their record or have misdemeanor probation and be released, they're going to not seek treatment. They're going to continue with that lifestyle of supporting their habit by stealing. And the simple fact is the 36% of these crimes, property crimes, get reported. I don't believe that. I believe it's far lower than that today. And the reason is that citizens have become somewhat jaded and frustrated about reporting crime. I believe it's probably closer to 1 in 4. We know that because in our department, when we go out and commit or conduct an investigation, we end up doing a search warrant at a location, and we find property that is stolen, identifications, and we go back and contact them. There was never a police report made. So I believe the victimization rate is far higher. I believe there's far greater numbers than 9% in terms of increases in crime, and we have to do something different. We have to restore integrity to our criminal justice system, or we're going to continue to see people victimized in our communities and lose confidence, trust, and support in our criminal justice system, including law enforcement.
District Attorney Gascón, your city has seen a drop in car break-ins recently. How are you achieving that?
Well, I think there is a variety of things. And first of all, look, I've been in the business for a little over 30 years, and anybody that tells you they know why crime went up or went down, run away from him, because there are usually a lot of explanations, and sometimes we understand some of the components, but I have never been able to get a full understanding of everything that is going on with crime at any given time, because we're always pulling many levers and many things are happening all at one time.
True.
So, yes, actually car burglaries in our city went through the roof. And it started before Prop 47, by the way. They started to go up, and we saw kind of an effect of, some people call it depolicing. I'm not so sure that that's a good term either, but, there was certainly very low level of arrest activity. And then we saw in this year, we have seen a 20% drop, and we have seen an increase in police activity in this area. So arguably, you can say that more thorough investigations by the police department are resulting in some of the reductions. And I believe some of them probably have, but I would be very, very careful not to attribute the entire 20% to that, because I think it's hard to tell. You have one major organization, by the way, a lot of the car break-ins that are happening in the Bay Area are not they're done by organized groups that are doing many, many at the same time. They're fencing it, and what we have seen is when we make some of those arrests, we see a drop, and none of that, by the way, would be impacted by Prop 47 one way or the other. These are not Prop 47 crimes. I think that even in the area of shoplifting, we have to be a little careful when we're talking about, shoplifting going up, because we know some stores that actually, they have tremendous reductions. So we have to be thoughtful about the way that we look at crime numbers. They are an indicator. They're a component of many other things. And I believe that one of the things that we as a society have to do is we have to evaluate how do we create sustainable public safety systems that are not going to break the bank, that are socially responsible. Where do we put our money? And that is one of the arguments and one of the drivers behind Prop 47. And I think that trying to go back to the future by trying to go back and create higher felony consequences for some of those low-level offenses is not necessarily going to take us to a place that may necessarily fix the problems. I think it's also important to understand the context. So, for instance, the $950 threshold before the prior threshold of $450, that was a threshold that was created over 2 decades ago. We did actually an adjustment for inflation when we were looking at the $950 level. It would have put actually us way over a $950 threshold. And we looked at other states around the union. They have a $1,500 threshold between a misdemeanor and a felony. We've seen it as high as $2,000. So let's be understanding that $450 or 20-some years ago is probably still more than $950 today. But on the other hand, to say that we were not incarcerating people on drug offenses and putting them in prison, it's more nuanced than that, right? Because we were putting people in prison for drug offenses, and people that, quite frankly, but for the color of their skin, they probably would never have gotten the first arrest that put them in place, because an equally situated white person using drugs at the same level would never have gotten arrested the first time and developed the history, the criminal history that led to that felony conviction. And look, we all have individual cases that we can go back to and we can attribute a lot of problems. And I understand that, what Jerry's saying, that, he's got these horror stories, and we all have the horror stories. The people have been arrested 40 times, 50 times, 60 times. But, we had those horror stories before Prop 47. Let's not hang our hat on that. And usually when you look at those horror stories, there are two ways to look at this thing, right? You can look at it and say, we're not locking them up, we're not doing enough on this end. The other part, sometimes we have to look at it and where do we feel as a society that has led to this part. And that's not to take personal responsibility from the individual, but that's to create collective responsibility. We all play a role, and I think, yes, we need to hold people accountable, but we also need to understand how people get to the place that they get there and try to deal with those issues as well.
Great, thanks. I want the audience to get a chance to ask some questions, but before we get to that, I just wanted each of you to have an opportunity to just take a minute or two to, from this perspective of looking ahead. So where should you've talked about some of these things already, but where should California go from here? What reforms or changes are most needed in California? Director Howard, do you want to start off?
Well, I'll focus my comments on the Prop 47 grant-making responsibilities that our board has. As we've talked about, we took the first 3 years of savings to operate the initial round one grants. And it'll be time for our board to look at this probably in September about how should the second round of grant funding be rolled out into the field? And one of the challenges, I think, is what we're talking about here today, and that is that with the grants having just been awarded last year in June, there's a ramp-up period when the services need to be established, subcontracts with service providers, and so on. We as yet don't have a whole lot of information available about what's working and what's doing well and what we should do more of. So our board needs to look at all of that and determine, there's certainly a good argument to be made that after all the work that went into that initial request for proposals, we should stay that course, but we'll need to look at that. And we won't have a whole lot of information coming in from grantees until a year from now, and we don't want to, delay getting the resources out into the field. So it's a little bit of let's see what we can about what's working well and what the board ought to prioritize for, how the next round of grant funding is rolled out, and we have to sort of stay on top of it as well. So those are my thoughts.
District Attorney?
Yeah, I think this is it's an opportunity for us to begin to look at the criminal justice system more as a science as opposed to what we have done for the last 30 or 40 years. Criminal justice policy in this country is usually driven by one bad case and emotional events, right? And we then go out and we create laws, we go lock more people up, we create 3 strikes, we do this, we do the other. And they're generally based on, one horrendous, one very tragic event. And very seldom do we look at criminal justice policy and do like perhaps people in the health profession do and start identifying what are the real issues, what is the science behind it, and what are the right level of interventions. We would never go to a brain surgeon and subject ourselves to brain surgery and someone that bases his or her decision to cut into your brain based on the last story or the last anecdote that someone else told them. But in the criminal justice system, we go out and we create state policy and we create 3 strikes. So we increase penalties because we had one horrendous event. The criminal justice system needs to become more scientific minded. We need to look at what are the things that work, what are the things that do not work. We need to understand that we may not have the answers, and there may be areas where we will never have the answer. But what I hope and pray is that we do not go back to the bad old days, and that we go back to thinking that we can continue to just lock people up and fill our jails and put more people in prison, and that somehow is going to take us to a better place. And then finally, I want to go back because I think since we're talking numbers, numbers are important. 2016 was the lowest crime rate numbers in the state since the early 60s. This is clearly 2 years into Prop 47. 2014 was the lowest crime rate numbers. We're never going to get to no crime. We're never going to get to no crime unless we're willing to put all of ourselves in jail. And we got to start thinking about, do we always want to be judged by the worst moment in our life? I think anybody in this room can go back to one day perhaps when you were a young person, or perhaps yesterday, where you did something really stupid and you say, I'm glad that a cop wasn't there, right? Let's think about those things, because when you happen to be black and poor, or Latino and poor, generally you get judged by that really bad day. And that cycle gets you into a system that never allows you to get out from.
Chief?
Yeah, I'll, first off, agree with George on 2 points he made. The jail is no place, or prison's no place for an individual with mental health issues. We clearly know that. However, when the institutions for mental health inpatient went away, that was the default. But it doesn't make them better. Secondly, drug treatment at one time was occurring in the prisons. However, when the inmate population got to a certain level and they started double and triple bunking individuals, then they had to put bunks in those locations where they were providing treatment. So the treatment facilities in the prisons went away. Had those facilities been there and treatment available in the prisons, I don't think we'd be here today. And so, yes, the prison population increase took away treatment in the prisons, but I would argue that there was a way to do both, to allow prison population to increase and to allow the drug treatment in the prison. George said something else that I will totally agree with. I don't want to see us ever go back to where we were. I think that's wrong. However, I've been in law enforcement now 39 years, been the police chief 17. I have never seen the pendulum in the criminal justice system swing so fast and so far left and stay so long as I have today. And I don't want to see it swing all the way back right. But sometimes that's what happens in our society. And it is because of a horror story that's out there, a tragedy that occurs. 3 Strikes originated in Fresno with Mike Reynolds and his daughter Kimber being killed in the Tower District. So I understand how that started. But I would like to see the pendulum in our criminal justice system get back to the middle so that we can balance both, that there's still severe consequences for those individuals that are thumbing their nose at society and being involved in the life of crime every day, career criminals, and be able to do treatment. There is a way to get there, but right now we have gone far too left and lenient in our dealing with some of these individuals that are victimizing people in our society.
Thank you. All right, so let's open it up for some questions. We have microphones out here, so raise your hand, and the folks around here with the microphones will come to you with a microphone and wait and ask your question until you have the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you for the conversation. I think one thing that we haven't heard here, we talk a lot about prisons and jails and consequences. We haven't talked about the after effect of when people do get out, right? A lot of the reasons of why people are going back into jail is the fact that we haven't taken care of what's happening in our communities. We release prisoners into the same communities that they've committed the crimes in. They can't find housing. They can't find jobs. They can't provide support for their children at schools. So we limit what they can do and the impacts they can make in their own community to support a better lifestyle. What role does that play in recidivism, and how do you see either the police tactics that are changing to make sure that we're not just talking about criminalizing those communities, but that we're actually providing more resources for jobs, for job training, for education, to make sure that we're holistically looking at the issue, right? And we're not just saying that, you know, more prison time is going to be better for everybody, because we know that gangs are in the prisons too, and they're calling a lot of the shots that happen in the streets. So how do we start talking about a holistic approach to recidivism and reducing crime when we know both systems, we're not talking about a holistic approach to serving those people that are in either addiction or committing crimes?
I like to take that, because that was one of the goals of Prop 47 was precisely that. Is the reinvestment part in trying to begin to create a different approach to people that are in the community, people that are being released from the institutions. Actually, you failed to mention one, too, and that is that once you have that felony conviction, you generally cannot get employment. You're precluded from getting housing. You often can get student loans. So once we give you that mark, we're basically telling you better go to a life of crime because we are not going to give you too many other opportunities, right? So a felony conviction has all kinds of other collateral consequences that we're not even discussing. But Prop 47 is a mild beginning of a process where we have to go back and see where do we want to put public resources. And some of that, frankly, is still not going to be enough. There's going to have to be a greater investment in the work that we do. You know, some of the, and I know I'm going to offend some people here, but some of the more enlightened countries in the world, like Germany, if you go to prison, a year before you are going to be released, you're actually working on reentry to the point that actually you start going and working, they find you employment because they actually train you beforehand, and you go back and forth, and it gets to the point literally where you spend the night in your institution, but in the daytime you're going to work. So by the time that you get out, you have housing, you have employment. You're not going to have to go back to the corner, walk and don't walk, and start slinging dope or hurting somebody because you're hungry, you don't have a roof over your head, and you don't have any place to go. But we give you $100, we give you a bus ticket, usually from the middle of the desert, go back to town, and you go figure it out. And by the way, report to your PO within the next 48 hours. And then when you get to the city, and $100, you spend it in McDonald's, right? And you're sleeping, in some corner. And then the next day you're hungry, and nobody gives you employment. Nobody's going to offer you housing. And then we are all shocked because this person has to go back and go and steal or do whatever. It's dishonest, is immoral, but that's what we do every single day, and we do it hundreds of times over and over and over.
Just one additional thought to add in terms of what else can the state be doing. As far as I know, the governor has not yet signed the budget bill. Is there news to that effect in the room? Okay, but there's a proposal included in this year's budget for $50 million in adult reentry and wraparound services, and that would be grant funding coming to the BSCC to administer. And what the budget bill outlines is that it should focus on housing needs, the rehabilitation of housing, and then what's referred to as a warm handoff. So obviously $50 million is not going to be able to help everybody, but that is in direct response to the very legitimate concern that you raised, because of course we know that the vast majority of people will someday get out of prison and return to the community, and those reentry services are vital.
Chief, do you want?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said in terms of transition to society is critical. For many, many years, that did not happen in the prison system. Then there was a change in terms of whenever a person was getting out of prison, they started preparing that individual their last 90 days, 6 months. And then when they did get out, there was a reentry program that was set up where you bring in individuals that are offering jobs, and they're in place where you can get free training, free clothing, free counseling, free treatment, all the things that you need to get a job. The challenge is, like, for example, housing authority vouchers. Individuals with a felony not able to get those individuals housing. So let's change that. That has to change to where, yes, just because the individual has a felony conviction doesn't mean they shouldn't get housing. I believe that they should be able to. And I do believe that felony conviction should not stay on a person's record forever. But I do believe that they can earn their way off of that felony conviction to misdemeanor to perhaps total expungement. I am fully supportive of that because that's what's going to allow our individuals to become productive members of society again today. But along the way, there still have to be some consequences for those individuals because if we don't have them, this is going to be seen as an entitlement versus them earning their way to being productive citizens.
My question's for Mia. This is based on a comment made by the District Attorney of San Francisco, where he indicated that LAPD numbers, one way or another, can kind of skew something either up or down. In the report, it seemed as though there was modifications made for the FBI because they had reported certain sex crimes or expanded those sex crimes. But yet in the LAPD, we found, with studies with a report from the LA Times, along with the newspapers, and also indicating the report that they had underreported their crimes. Yet, why were those numbers not adjusted? Why was the entire LAPD removed?
Sure. So I handle a lot of the crime analysis in this report, so I'm happy to tackle that. We did a number of things to make sure that what we're saying, including in the report, is really accurate and jives with reality. What happened in LA was exactly as you said. LA Times reported a serious underreportment of aggravated assault. And that was something that had been going on for some time. There was a data integrity unit that was put in place to improve the data collection and recording of crime in LA. So from the period from 2008 to 2014, there was serious underreporting of that. And then it was reported accurately in 2015 and 16. So what we did is we took out LAPD only just to see to what extent it's driving those crime numbers. And what we see is that the crime rates actually decreased quite a bit once you take that out, because that accounted for a big part of the increase. But I think importantly, and even if you do include LAPD and you look at California as a state with that, even accounting for these changes in sex crimes, that is a component of violent crime, what we see is the increase between 2014 and 2016, just compared to the rest of the country and other states, you see at least 20 other states having bigger increases in violent crime rate than we saw in California. So this isn't just about making adjustments. What we're seeing in California is undoubtedly an increase in violent crime. We need to pay attention to that. But it's also part of a broader trend, and we need to determine what is behind that if we're going to be able to solve those kind of issues.
Jonathan Feldman, I'm the lobbyist for the Police Chiefs Association, and I had a question for the researchers as well. So immediately after Prop 47, we commissioned our own crime report using data from our members, because we felt there was going to be an impact on property crime, and there was, as far as the information that we had, that was very similar to what you guys found as well. And then looking at Cal DOJ numbers, we also saw a significant increase in the value of stolen goods. And as a lobbyist, I'm always looking to build coalitions to get bills passed, so I started reaching out to the retailers, Home Depot, Macy's, Target, Walmart. And sure enough, their internal numbers, which don't always reflect everything in the crime data, are through the roof. As of 2016, we're $500 million higher in stolen good value than in 2014. And I didn't see any mention of that statistic in the report. You did mention something about the retailers' potential for change between 2015 and 2016, because you see a slight drop. But I was wondering if you guys had reached out to talk to any of the retailers, look at their internal numbers, or looked at the value of stolen goods as a statistic in this report.
We have not. We did not have access to those data. We do mention, as you point out in the report, that that's one possible explanation for the drop in the shoplifting numbers that we see in 2016. We observed the increase in 2015. Then we see a drop in 2016. To what extent that entire drop between 2015 and 16 is driven by the non-reporting, or if there are changes to shoplifting, it's unclear. But those kind of data that you're talking about would shed light on that. And I would love to see those numbers as well and see a longer trend to see how that's playing out. I'll reach out to you. Other questions?
Oh, hi. I'm really encouraged by the recognition of the need of what was called, I guess, a warm handshake, that there needed to be a connection between all of the services starting that happens when they were an inmate is incarcerated and then leading to the community. And I'm wondering how much progress has been made in terms of that. I've been observing first as a state employee in charge of a program dealing with the anti-recidivism programs, and now as a board member for, a volunteer board member for a number of different organizations, that the connection between, like, for example, there's all this effort inside and then nothing, there's no connection. But I'm also wondering if there is a discussion about the design of where a lot of these programs take place for maximum efficiency. And the examples that I would give would, and these are anecdotal, but for example, the attempt to do an arts and corrections theater program inside in the middle of a cafeteria slash gym where you've got, you know, so much hubbub around that actually getting deep into the program was near impossible. Flip side, a small room individually, but with half of the inmates at the highest level and half of them recently coming out of SHU and no correctional officer in the room. Again, a theater program, which to me just seems to be dangerous, and no recognition of how to implement the programs. Is design thought of as all either in the jails or the prisons today?
Well, I can certainly take that one. So the legislature has passed and the governor has signed a number of jail constructions. I'm not going to focus on prisons or prison programming because that's not my area of expertise. But the funding for new jails has absolutely focused on providing space for programming as a central part of 3 recent bills, SB 1022, SB 863, and SB 844. So again, as part of the process for determining how counties had to apply for those, there was a certain attention given in the rating criteria for what kind of programming was going to be offered. So specifically in response to your question, and you know, it's not every jail across the state, but those that have participated in these funding opportunities are paying attention to the need for programming space within the physical plan. And that's for new projects. And then I think you would see, you know, across the state, of course, all kinds of different examples where programming can be well supported, you know, within the physical plan, and then some of the challenges that you're talking about. And then in terms of the warm handoff portion of your question, that's something that the BSCC, of course, will have to consider, assuming that this $50 million does come through, in developing, you know, an application process. Where are those kinds of services most effectively delivered, and so on. So, you know, please stay tuned. I'd be happy to make contact with you afterward to talk more about that.
Great, thank you.
I can tell you in Fresno County, there's a program, there's a transition program called TJC, and it is transitioning those individuals back to the community. And it has been a very, very effective program, but it does take up quite a bit of space within the jail. And so there's always, for the sheriffs, a debate as to do I maximize my bed space, or do I take more space to do these innovative programs? And it's a challenge. What we do need is more space in the jails to be able to implement those types of programs. And maybe it doesn't have to be a jail. Maybe it can be more of a minimum security type facility. I do know one thing, in the California prisons today, with the reduction, I think is about 1/3 of the inmates no longer there. There has to be a lot of room for those types of programs to be re-implemented, but I don't know that. I've been away from the prisons for a few years.
All right. Well, we're running out of time, so I want to take the opportunity to thank our panel here for providing all that excellent insight and discussion that we've had here today, for you guys to come here as an audience. So thank you all.